Hello, my name is Jaden Chong. I'm one of the teachers here, and today I'm just going to be providing a bit of a video lesson mainly in relation with how we use the wrists and how we can apply that to technique as well as apply that to pieces as a general. So, for one of my students, for instance, I've been working on a few pieces. I've talked about some of my own lessons before, such as the Arabesque by Bergmüller. So on and so forth, and it can also be applied to a great variety of other techniques. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's from something Baroque or something classical, romantic. It can be applied to anything. I'll say, for instance, I'll apply it to one of my own personal favorites, Claude Debussy's The Girl with the Flaxen Hair, just using the wrist. So, for those who are watching, I want you to pay close attention to how I use my wrist and how I'm using less of the fingers but more of the wrist. I mean, obviously the fingers are to be obviously important, because otherwise, without fingers, we have no piano, because otherwise, ow. But, watch the wrists more closely. Slightly different attempt at that one. It's been a little while since I practiced that one. But in reference with that, there's a lot more motion going on in the wrists, even with sections with more extended notes. Motion. You don't always need to go up and down. That's usually kind of more for the end of the phrase, but that can be very useful. Now, in terms of how to go about wrist motion, because I tend to see a lot of the students that I have, they tend to go about things with using their fingers, which is readjusting, pardon me. So, they tend to go about things, whether it's scales or pieces, they tend to be using lots of their fingers instead of their wrists. So if I were to do something such as a C major scale, excuse me, now notice how the wrist isn't moving so much, and there's a little bit more, there's a lot more of a kind of, slight more of a percussive tint to it, or otherwise more of a kind of harsher sound. Now I'm going to play this with much more of a wrist rotation. The difference here is while we're still getting the same kind of clarity for notes, we're still getting the same clarity for notes, but it's not necessarily as harsh. Now obviously this all depends on the context of the piece. Sometimes you might want a harsher sound, something perhaps in the line of Bela Bartok. I can't quote a piece off the top of my head, unfortunately, but I know that sometimes a lot of the composers after 1900, they tend not to use always so much legato. Sometimes it's more of percussive textures. If I were to improvise something here. sometimes you don't necessarily need to have legato, but for a lot of our pieces, even a slight contradiction to what I said, sometimes you will have pieces which are more of a direct legato line. And even without some of the more heavier kind of percussive sounding sort of things happening here, what happens is that if it's too heavy of a sound, if you tend not to have wrist, it tends to be much more of a heavier sound. If I were to play this just with my hands alone, or if I wanted to do something more classical, say such as a piece from the grade 7 A and B selection, a piece from Kozilek. It's a much kind of more percussive kind of tedious sound, da 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 da, versus if you were to try doing it with wrist. So, now the big thing is, how do we achieve this? In reference with our wrists, some of the exercises that I've tended to find, and I'll link this book in the YouTube description of this video, they tend to be found in a book which really specializes in wrist technique. So, one of the exercises that I've tended to learn is doing things, not necessarily with your thumb, but starting off with your main 3 fingers. So you'd notice this fingers 2, 3, 4. I'm using the right hand as an example here, and with our left hand, these would be our 2, 3, and 4. So I'd start my note C, and I would start doing this hands separately. But the exercise that the first exercise that I want to talk about uses uses 2 fingers, our fingers 2 and 3, almost as if we're in the peace sign. So what I want us to do, start on a piano texture, as in piano dynamic. So, the exercise that I've just shown us is it's in using more emphasis notes without going into accents, leaning more into the fact of tenutos. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with tenutos are basically when we give a little bit more emphasis to a note, and this is this kind of exercise. And with this exercise, we have to really slur our notes. We have to make sure they're very smooth. So in this case, I'm putting the emphasis on our first note and making sure that our wrist rotation, when we're going up with our right hand, we're moving our wrist kind of downward as a spiral. So almost as if we're going like ooh, ooh. And when we're doing something like a scale, it'd be something closer to. So when we're going up, we're kind of flowing up a little bit. So when we're going up, whoop, whoop, almost as if we're kind of curving around a little bit. And then when we're going down, we're kind of going to go on a little downward trajectory, and when we change, we finish off with just a nice little curve. And reference with the curve, it does not need to be an overly exaggerated movement. If we go with something like, sometimes it can be very useful for helping us to get our feet kind of on the ground, so to speak, or wrist kind of on the hand, for lack of a better pun. So, when it comes to doing this with our right hand, let's start off with this exercise, actually. We're going to lean in. When we're going up, leaning more into our index, and then our middle, into our fingers. Index, middle, index, middle, index. notes middle. And then when we're going down, we go with the opposite direction. So leaning in. So when we're going down, our wrist is going just that little bit left. Another key factor here is that I see a lot of people actively relaxing by kind of bringing our hands up, but sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes we need to actually bring our wrist down. Not always completely putting our hand down, because otherwise our hand's going to be too tense. But when we're going down, making sure that our wrist is going down and relaxing along with that. Now, to end this, I'll show you a slightly harder variation using 3 fingers this time. We're using our fingers 2, 3, 4. And fingers 2, 3, 4. My fingers are slightly curved on this one, so hello. So fingers 2, 3, 4. I'll show us on the right hand, and then I'll show you both the 2 finger and the 3 finger on the left hand. So when we use our right hand, we're using our to note here is that we don't finish wrist rotation until the last note. Da, 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 da. So when we use this, we kind of begin our process for the first 2 notes. And then by that third note, we kind of begin our position again. And now I'm going to be showing us our left hand. So, in this case, we're going to be using we're going to be using our fingers 3 and 2. Left hand. I'll actually move a little bit higher, just for ease of the camera. Once again. So in this particular case, emphasis on our first note, or our lower note here, and then our higher note here. And when it comes to our wrist rotation, it's going up and then going up, going up. When it comes to our scale, fingers up, we're going whoop and then whoop. And when we're going down, and this will be a little bit tricky, with our left hand, we're going down. We're not necessarily moving our hand, but our wrist. Moving our wrist down. Finishing back up here. And now I will show us our 3 finger technique here. So using the fingers 2, 3, and 4. In this case, we're going to strive to maintain a very even tone. So we need to make sure that it's not always tenuto. Sometimes the tenuto can be very useful, but after a while, when it comes to doing this, I want us to make sure we have a very even tone. This technique can be applied to pretty much any piece you can get your hands on. So, I'll move back to the original position. A personal piece that I'm working on right now is actually quite difficult. It's called The Wedding in Trollhagen by Edvard Grieg, and the wrist rotations can be used in many a plethora of ways. So I'll just do a little intro section here, and I'm just going to play it very quickly because it is quite a lot. So, lots of the wrist rotations were used. This can be done with singular notes, this can be done with chords, it can be done with pretty much anything, and especially with arpeggios. If I were to do something such as a C major arpeggio, it can be done with both hands, singular hands, or if people had three hands, or three hands, for a little bit of light-hearted humor there. But that being said, I hope this proves to be useful to people, and I hope you have a lovely day.